My name is Ann Marks, and actually Mrs. J.S. Marks. I'm a widow, my husband having passed away a few years ago. I came to Brownsville from Memphis, Tennessee, my home, when I married him 65 years ago. His father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were all Rothschilds, and they came from Germany originally. The family history goes that Mr. Rothschild was a baker by trade in Germany, and his reputation was he was so neat he could cook and bake and never have a spot on him. And his daughter, Betty, who was my mother-in-law, married Julius Marks. He was a distant cousin of the Rothschilds, and he was an orphan. Until he was 21, he lived in an orphanage, and they brought him to Brownsville, and he worked for them at Rothschild's store, and he lived in the back room at the big house, And when he married Mother Betty, he moved to the front room.
Oh.
And all the brothers worked in the same store. It was like a commissary. And they were very successful. They bought land, and they farmed, and they had the store. And when the firm disbanded because there was too many families in it, Julius Marks and his son, Bubba, opened the same type of store of their own on the square. It's where the utility department is now. And they carried on until they went out of business, or in the 60s.
I'm Henry Levy.
I'm David Levy. Well, the way I always thought that the Jews ended up in Brownsville was this is as far as the railroad track went.
Oh, really?
So they got off the train.
Oh.
And I don't know whether that's true or not, but when my mother always said that one of the Sternbergers was on the train heading west and looked out the window of the train, and his brother was walking down the street, so he got off the train.
A ram's horn. How long this has been a part of this congregation, I don't know. But when I came here in 1990, it was lying here and not being used. So I volunteered to be, as an old trumpet player, the ram's horn player on High Holy Days. I'm Bob Kalin. Came here from Tallahassee, where I was a professor at Florida State University. Resigned to join my oldest youngster, my daughter Susan, here in Brownsville. Quickly joined the temple because it was so different from all other Jewish synagogues I had ever been a part of or seen. I got intrigued by the looks of the place and by its history. It seems as though back about 1847 that one of the Felsenthals settled here, had come from Bavaria, Germany, opened up a store, and time was joined by other members of the Felsenthal clan, and this store was open right through the Civil War and right up to 1970 or so, when it was burned to the ground. but just before burning, it was known as the oldest department store in the state of Tennessee in continuous use.
My name is Carolyn Celia Key Rainey, and I'm proud to say that I'm fifth generation Brownsvillian of the Jewish religion. My great-great-grandfather, Isaac Levi, L-E-V-I, arrived in Tennessee somewhere in the mid-1860s. And from what we can trace so far, he was a very religious, Orthodox man. Around the same time, in the early to mid-1860s, two brothers, Joe and Saul, brought a Torah to Brownsville from their homeland in Germany. Already residing here at that time were a couple named Jacob and Caroline Felsenthal. They immediately embraced the Torah, provided a house for it in their home, and my great-great-grandfather Isaac became the first lay reader of the temple.
We've been talking about the Torah that was brought here by the Sternberger brothers about 1860. And this is it. Kept in our ark. And it's covered in its holiday dress. It was 100 years old when it was brought here, about 1860. Since then, we've had 130 years, 140 years go by, so it's almost a quarter of a millennium old, 250 years old. Don't touch it. It's sheepskin that should not be touched. It should be honored. A Torah is like a member of the family. Without it around, might as well not hold services at all.
This is Fred Silverstein. This is my son Fred Jr. 60 years ago, this month, I married Fred Silverstein and moved to Brownsville from Memphis. He was born here in Brownsville and lived here most of his life. He went to school in Jackson but moved back, I guess he was about 18 years old, and lived here until he died at Blythe May at the age of 88.
What you're viewing now is a photo of my great-grandfather Emil Tam, my father's grandfather, who was the second lay reader and who had been raised, who had studied for the rabbinate in Germany and Bavaria, and then came to the United States, first settled in Chicago, and then settled in Brownsville sometime in the 1860s, and went into the mercantile business. Because he had studied for the rabbinate, he was learned in Jewish ways, and had we have here in the box some memorials or some memories of artifacts of what he brought with him from Bavaria. His Bible, his Tefillin, is that correct, Bob?
Emil Tam and Maya Rothschild came shortly after the Civil War to join the Jews already here, and so that made quite a collection of Jews, and so they decided to build a building, set up a cemetery, and start meeting regularly. So this very building that we're sitting in today was built in 1880, a dedication held in 1882, and it's exactly where it was then, with the exception that the outside has been bricked in since, and the stained glass windows have been put in.
This temple was originally, the way I always heard the story, was a Reformed temple. One of our Sternberger relatives way back in Germany, France, All Saints, Lorraine, was one of the founders of Reformed Judaism.
I'm Betty Bird Feist, and I'm the daughter of Alice Sternberger Bird and Sam Bird. We're all the Sternbergers were relatives, and the Felsenthals were relatives, and We all went to temple here at Temple Addis, Israel, since I was a little girl. We had a choir consisting of, I think there were 3 or 4 members of the choir. And Aunt Gertie Levy was the pianist. She played the organ. There was no piano. That time we had a gorgeous organ, not the one that we have now. This is gorgeous too. But anyway, Aunt Gertie was Jewish. She was a member of the temple. And her sister, Aunt Celie Rothschild, was the leader of the choir and trained the choir. And then we had Miss Rosa Bonds, or one of her descendants. She was a descendant in the choir, and she sang. She was not Jewish. She was of another religion. And Mr. Johnny Stamen was also a member of another congregation, not Jewish. And they did this because they were good friends, and everyone was a good friend in the temple. At that time we had such a tremendous congregation. There were 42 Jewish families here then. Well, we sat over here, and Tam sat here, and the Felsenthal's sat over here.
Always sat in the same place.
And then the Dashriggs sat in the middle of this row here. We always sat in the same place.
And nobody dared sit in our place.
No, sir.
Well, for many years, I would bring a great big pot of coffee and the schneck, in which we had a nice Afro-American who made the schnecken for us, and it was delicious, and everybody stayed, and we had a nice visit with everyone. Instead of everybody getting up after the service and running home, we stayed and visited, and it was lovely until everybody said, well, there are not enough of us to have it, so we won't do that anymore.
We had matzo ball soup, we had chicken, we had chopped liver.
You did eat food, huh?
Some Jewish food, but not a lot of that was passed on to us. I never had stuffed cabbage till I was an adult. I never had, although I knew about the filter fish, I just never went. Of course, we had to get all that food outside of Brownsville when it was called for. But as far as kosher or Jewish cooking or things like that, that didn't exist in my family. Now,
I'm Herbert Feist, and I married into the family. I came here in 1935 because of Hitler. There was no future in Germany. I had relatives in St. Charles, Missouri. My father's sister came in 1897. Her husband was a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi. He had to retire. But Betty was going to Lindenwood College in St. Charles. I lived across the street from the college. And we met on Yom Kippur in a little shul that my uncle had started in St. Charles because the Orthodox couldn't drive to St. Louis on Shabbos and holidays, so he opened a little shul in somebody's home.
In all the years that we've had a temple, we've never had a real rabbi to services. We always had a lay rabbi. When I first came here, Mr. Sternberger, Abe Sternberger, was the lay reader in the temple. And then after he retired, he moved to Texas. My brother-in-law, Morton Felsenthal, became the lay reader. And he was lay reader until Fred Jr. and Bob Kalin. Bob Kalin came first, took over, and became the lay reader.
Dr. Kalin actually studied and read before he had a service on Friday night and brought us a little Jewish information, which was very unusual.
The service is straight out of the book, where you simply say your blessings to God, say the Shema, read the Kaddish, and say goodnight. It's at most a 20-minute service, actually. No sermon. On high holy days, however, we're bound to have about 20 here for a good portion of the services. And then we will go through the entire book and read all portions of the service for all the days of the New Year and of Yom Kippur. We have an ancient Bible, and in the back someone started to record various marriages, deaths, births, and other similar events. Unfortunately, we can't read many of them now. The first one I can read, about a third of the way down, is Henry Solomon to Josephine Sternberger. They got married in October 7th of 1885. Many births are recorded here. Kept on going with births. Marriages. Here's Sandra Rice, was married to Fred Silverstein Jr. in June of 11th, 1982. These were the deaths. And I can't read them all, but this one was Jacob Levy, who died on October 9th of 1889. And then I can't read most of them. Here, Ed Felsenthal, and then the next few are illegible. Births, deaths, memorandum. The Hammond organ was installed on October 18th, 1945.
This photograph was taken in the 1920s. You'll see Ike Rothschild leaning on one of his display counters. To his immediate left are two of his workers. In the forefront, standing side by side, are Julius Marx Jr. and his brother Edwin Marx. And next to Edwin is my mother, Mary Rothschild Key.
This is Jonas Sternberger. He was a cotton buyer. He also owned land and sharecropped. This is in his cotton office. All the people in town weren't just merchants. They were farmers, or quote courthouse farmers. They loaned money on the court square. My grandfather, Jonas, loaned
out of his hip pocket.
Out of his hip pocket, yes. And I'm sure charged outrageous interest, and that's and he bought and sold cotton. And when the cotton market crashed, the year before the stock market crashed, my father went broke. And my grandfather went broke. They kept the house because it was in my grandmother's name, and my grandmother was selling eggs the day that the stock market crashed. And somebody said, "Helen, isn't it so terrible?" And she said, "I can't tell the difference." We've always had servants. When I brought people home from college, they had never seen anything like it in their lives. You know, one was Jewish, two, he lived on a farm. At the time, in the 60s and 70s, the people that worked on the farm were black. It looked like a giant plantation with all these greenhouses.
My great-grandfather, Moses Bauman, was a Mason. In fact, all of my male family members were Masons and took the secret oath and went to the meetings and everything. And I can remember hearing the story that when Moses died, my great-grandfather, he was insistent that he would be buried with his trowel and shovel. And I always found that to be quite hysterical, especially being Jewish.
You can just look around at the temple now. Even the windows. I haven't been in a shul or temple anywhere else where they had graven images on the windows. Judaism here was just always kind of off the cuff. They kind of made it whatever was convenient at the time. I know the joke was for a long time they had services at 6:30 so they could go to the football game at 7:30. And I'm not saying any of that is bad. It's just we grew up in a real assimilated place.
When I was coming up here, I attended Temple Addis Israel, but because we didn't have a lot of activities that are associated with temples today and Jewish community centers and so forth and so on, my mother and father thought all religions were better than none. So my experience, in addition to being Jewish, I sang in the First Methodist Choir. I went to all the summer Bible schools. I loved the Baptist the best because they had the best food. I couldn't stand the Church of Christ Bible School because not only did they have crummy food, you couldn't sing, you couldn't dance. They were very sour and dour to me.
I don't think there was much anti-Semitism here. It was more like they just didn't know what Jews were. It was just weird for them. The older Jews, the older Christians that came up with my parents when there were lots of Jews in town, they always talked about it, so they seemed to really enjoy having a Jewish community. By the time I got here, it was like, what's a Jew?
And after my grandfather died, Rothschild and Company began to disintegrate. There were no male heirs left. And in those days, my grandmother, my mama, had been raised as a true Southern lady, and she didn't have a lot of business sense. And each of the three daughters probably thought, of course I'm too young to remember the squabbling and squibbling, but at the end of the day, it all kind of disintegrated. The store closed, and my family moved to Berkeley, California. I was 10 years old, and I was in total cultural shock. Because what I thought was Jewish in Brownsville was really kind of Jewish-Christian, semi-Jewish.
Louise, my mother, your wife, had a term, Haywood County Yiddish.
Yeah, right.
And one of the interesting things when I left the community and used the word and everybody would look at me was dokus. What is a dokus?
Well, I think, I'm not too familiar with the Yiddish myself, but I think it's supposed to be tuckus, which is where you sit.
And so in Haywood County, what did they do with...
I know what you're getting at now. These people in Haywood County, I'd say at least since War II, or maybe even prior to War II, really didn't know anything about Yiddish or Hebrew or any of those call them foreign tongues. And they made up their own words. It'd be a combination of a Southern expression with some Yiddish.
But politically, I did feel like the Jewish population tried to distance itself from the Jim Crow laws and the terrible rampant racism and bigotry. Now, I'm not saying that all Jews in Brownsville succeeded, but my family raised me with that sense, which made us polarly opposite from most of the other local townspeople.
So do you think the Jews in the community helped with the plight of blacks in Haywood County?
Now, which way are you putting that? To keep them subjugated or to get them out of subjugation?
You tell me. Did they...
I don't think the Jews of Haywood County have done a thing to bring these people to raise their standard of living. Not a bit.
Well, do you think you did, or were you just caught up in making
Well, I have tried to, and I hadn't been caught up in the local routine. But I've never made enough to make an indentation at any point. It would take a fortune to do it.
And so you're saying other people had the fortune and you didn't?
Yeah. I didn't agree with the don't want to use the word form, but that's all I can think of at this time. The form of Judaism that is practiced here. There's no older Jewish family in the whole United States than the Sternbergers and the Felsenthals. They're the oldest, I dare say. But they just have been totally unprogressive. And they want to run things their way, the way they've run it for years, with no changes, and without asking anyone else what they like, what they want. And they just, and of course the Sternbergers and the Felsenthals and the Tams never got along. And that hadn't helped the community with the few people that are left.
You don't remember any of the quarrels, any of the arguments, any of the particulars?
None of them amounted to a hill of beans. It was just a case of somebody, if one of the Tams would get up and want something done to the temple, the Sternberger would get up and he didn't want it. They were always fighting each other.
Everybody was too close. They knew each other too long. It was just family. Everybody has a little, especially being in a predominantly Christian community, one person wants the services this way, one person wants them the other way. I don't like we hire the choir every year to sing high holidays. It's not my cup of tea, but everybody else likes it. I would like to have a rabbi in it every once in a while. We've never had one except for Rabbi Sternberger, who lives in Washington, D.C. now.
And the only reason you had him, he was related.
During the last year or so, our membership has declined to the point where we have only as few as 2 or 3 attend services regularly on Friday. We might go as much as 8 or 9, but some of those have to be friends of the various families, Christians in town, who will study, pray with us.
And like all small towns, people they went to college, they had better offers in the cities, doctors, lawyers. Now, my son, the doctor, did not want to be my son, the doctor in Brownsville, or my son, the lawyer. You know, the temple now is really dying, and everybody seems to have a real hard time with the death of the temple.
We continue to get enough membership to continue financially, but too few people to hold services regularly, and so it is probably declining this year to the point where we don't have services every Friday night. No one will show up.
Well, we started having a paid choir.
Yes.
And we started recently, very recently, we allowed the Church of Christ to come in and use the temple on Sunday for their services.
I moved to Brownsville in June of 1987 to assume my responsibilities as vicar at Christ Episcopal Church here on North Washington. And I hadn't been here just a few months when I received a phone call inviting me to come to the High Holy Day services here at Temple. As a priest, I see Judaism as part of my religious heritage, and like I would honor my mother or my grandmother, so I honor my religious forebear as well, and kind of enjoy coming over and worshiping in a situation where I don't have to run the show like I do across the street with the Episcopal Church. It's also a pleasure for me to work with this congregation because they have been and continue to be a really important part of our community. The building here not only is used for Jewish worship on Friday nights, but also frequently is used as as a concert hall. In fact, last year, Brownsville Does Broadway was produced right here on the Bema with major pieces of music and acting that come from popular musicals that were on Broadway. Then there's the Wednesday morning musicale, which meets on Monday night, except when performing on Sunday afternoon. And they have even permanently placed their Steinway piano here, which is used in the service sometimes. I've been taught a lot of things about, in the Christian church we call it ecumenism, and I've learned to call it the reality of brotherhood and sisterhood by working not only with my church but also with the congregation of Temple of Israel.
There is a new set of bylaws which guides the temple, and one of the things the bylaws leads us to is a trust agreement that we wrote up that will allow the temple to gradually become a civic owned and run place. If we get to the point where there's not enough funds to run it, then the trustees will be succeeded by successor trustees that consist of the mayor of the town, the county executive of the county, a banker, and whatever Jew might be left. And those folks would take control of the temple and would allow the building to be used for civic purposes.
We've done this big trust with the temple and everything. If the city, we give it to the city, which is kind of strange, but if the city doesn't do anything with it, they're going to take the windows to the museum in Mississippi along with the Torahs. Now, Rabbi Sternberger, who does know a little about Judaism, wants us to give the Torahs to another synagogue because he thinks the Torah is a living thing and it shouldn't go to a museum.
Now, who does he look like? Take your hands out your mouth.
And he's the Jewish future of Haywood County.
That's it.
They've done so much over the years and continue to do so much for our community. And whatever happens with the congregation and so forth, I know that the building and the Judaica will remain as a magnificent memorial to the fact that people who cared came here. They loved this place. They put their souls and their bodies and their blood into it. And they will have left a wonderful legacy.
We're standing in front of the gates at Addis Israel Cemetery. In an area that used to be all country has been recently developed, just in my lifetime. When I was growing up here in the 40s and 50s, none of these homes were here. When the first Jewish families purchased this land, it was considered out in the country in Haywood County. The reason it was so far from the center of town where the temple is, about 3 miles from here, is because we were Jewish and we were not allowed to be buried in the city cemetery. So my ancestors purchased this land, and when there was a funeral in those days, the coffin would have to be brought on a wagon drawn by mules. My great-great-grandfather, Isaac Levi, I believe was the first person interred here in 1869. And one of the ironic things about Brownsville, Haywood County, and my ancestry is I can't read the headstone because it's in Hebrew. But I know it's here, and it's on the Rothschild plot, which was his son-in-law who married his daughter, Mary Levi. So the large monument denotes Meyer and Mary. And we also have on this plot a tombstone of a baby who was born and died here when they were very, very young. We're looking at the Berg Monument family headstone. The Bergs are a prominent Jewish family in Brownsville, but they actually lived about 20 miles away in Ripley. The 2 footstones here at the front of the plot denote Samuel Berg, who was of my great-grandfather's generation, and his wife, Alice. These are the grandparents of Betty Feist. Betty is married to Herbie. This footstone here in the center of the front of the plot is Betty Feist's brother, who died when he was a cadet at West Point. And as you can see, his name was Sam Berg, Jr. I'm showing you the Bashrick plot now, in particular the footstone for Irma Bashrick Goodman, who was a single lady here in Brownsville in the early 1900s up through the 40s. And she ran a butcher shop, which was highly unusual for a woman in that day, with her sister Cecil. We're looking at the headstone now of the Goldsmith family. Mr. Lewis B. Goldsmith, I believe, migrated to Brownsville from Wisconsin or Minnesota, and in fact they went back there and lived for a while. He married Henrietta Levi Goldsmith, who is my great-great-aunt. She was the sister to Mary Levi Rothschild. Her daughter is on this next plot over with the headstone Sternberger. She was Helen Goldsmith Sternberger and was a very academically and religiously oriented woman. She was the historian for the temple from the early 1900s until her death in 1980. She married Jonas Sternberger, who was a cotton merchant here in Brownsville. Now this is a very interesting monument here at the Jewish Cemetery. It's a Sternberger, and I wouldn't swear to this, but it might be Jonas Sternberger's father. But what's interesting about this monument is the symbol of the Confederacy on it. In the circle in the middle of the monument, you will see the initials engraved UCV, which is the Union of the Confederacy, and he was a veteran. Shame on him. We're now standing on another prominent Jewish family from Brownsville, whose last name is Tam. And when I was growing up, they all lived together in one house, kitty-corner to the temple. They were fabulous, fabulous, warm-hearted, very kind, and ironically seemed to adore children. What's unusual about this family in Brownsville is that it was made up of 4 brothers and 2 sisters. And none of them ever married except for one of the sisters, who married a Silverstein. So most of us in the cemetery are related to each other as cousins, nephews, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, except for the Tams. They have no heirs save the Silverstein family. In the very beginning, when the need arose for the Jewish community to have its own cemetery, and this land was located and purchased, the community decided to leave ample frontage in the front of the cemetery to accommodate the horses and the carriages and the wagons that would bring out the coffin and the mourners. And once you got inside these gates, which of course did not look like they do now, there was no hierarchy or priority or placement. It was kind of first come, first served. That's why you'll see a lot of families on one plot, and then you'll go a space, skipping several plots, and the same family will reappear. because as people died, they were able to come out and pick out their own plot. Then as the years went by and the Jewish community grew and grew and grew, sad but in a way a positive thing, we needed additional acreage. So toward the rear of the cemetery, which is the southern end, there was a very good friend in the Brownsville community, Dr. John Thornton, who sold us part of his cotton farm, which used to surround the whole cemetery. And that's in the rear on a slight incline. And that's what we refer to as the Nouveau Dead. We're looking at the plot of Jaime and Ruth Greenberg, both who were brother and sister and never married, and lived in Brownsville when they were young, grew up here with my family and others, and then moved to Mississippi. And in 1997, when Jaime died, that's when I reacquainted with Ruth, who came up for his funeral. And then just a little over a year later, Ruth herself died and is interned here. So this is one of our newest graves in the cemetery. And you'll notice Jaime's footstone, as so many of the males buried here. He was a U.S. Army World War II veteran. And in point of fact, during World War II, for such a small community, we lost 3 young men, all of whom I'm related to. We're looking at the headstone of Herbert Sternberger Sr., who was in the Navy in World War I. He was a contemporary of my great-grandfather, and I believe he was the father to Jonas Sternberger. Now these people come from the same area, the Marxes, near where the Baumanns came from. And you see that denoted on the Melanie part of the headstone, where you see Frauenburg-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine was an area that was geographically between France and Germany, and it was fought over for centuries, and it had an intensely dense Jewish population. And during all the battles for dominance, that was when a lot of Jewish immigrants would leave and come over to America, such as the Marxes and the Baumanns. So there were a lot of people here that knew each other from the old country.
All right, we're looking at the graves belonging to Joseph Davis and his 3 wives. This is Joseph in front of us here. And as you can see, he lived to be almost 100 years old, didn't he? And then his 3 wives, Carolyn, buried here, there. I forget what her name was. And then the 3rd wife down there.
Alice. What I was told all my life is that this plot contains the remains of some of the victims from the plague that swept through Brownsville in the mid-1800s around the time of the Civil War. And I just noticed that this is one of a little baby who was just 16 days old. So every time I come out here, I learn something new. And of course, if I could ever get some etchings off the Hebrew, I'd know even more. We're looking at the Baumann plot, and what I find so interesting about some of the Jewish history in Brownsville, Moses and Rosa Baumann were both very religious Jews, yet Moses was also a devout Mason, which has its formation in England, of course, in the skills and trade clubs and in Christianity. And when Moses died, he was adamant that he be buried with his trowel and shovel. Then this is my father, Bernard Key Sr., who also was in World War II. He was in the Secret Service branch, so to speak. He fought the Battle of the United States. This is my mother, Mary, and this is my younger brother, who was killed in an automobile wreck when he was 19. His name's Ike Tillman Rothschild Key. This is really morbid now, but we're standing in the middle of my plot, which I had designated with my cornerstones, the R being for Rainey, which is my married name, and R for Rothschild, my family name. I wanted to make sure I didn't get put in the wrong place. And we're in the new section of the cemetery now, and you can see it's not very occupied. I'll tell you something very interesting I didn't know that the funeral directors told me. The custom is, which they made us follow here in the Jewish cemetery, because of course all the local morticians were Christians, that when you're dead, you're buried with your face facing east, so that when the sun comes up, you're facing it. And I found that out a couple of years ago because I wanted my headstone to actually be facing the other way, and they told me that was not allowed. I find that a very interesting fact of burial etiquette.
Our temple is turned 180 degrees from what it should be, because the bema is at the western end, and it should be at the eastern end. And at the eastern end because that's where Jerusalem is.
Right.
So,
Maybe that has something to do, too, with the being buried facing the east.
yes, I would be a bit surprised.
Yeah. This is the Levy family, L-E-V-Y, and I am related to them on both sides, from the Felsenthal side and from the Levy side. Louise Sternberger Levy, and she was my third cousin. And a poker-playing son of a gun. In fact, we buried her with 2 decks of cards. I believe we're looking at the most recent grave, dear human being, Robert Felsenthal. Robert came to Brownsville from Chicago, Illinois. He was a brilliant student and graduated with honors from the University of Chicago. He lived in Brownsville all his life and was a bachelor until well in his 50s, when he married a widowed woman from Memphis. And he died in '97 at age 87.
My name is Don Brooks. I'm the Episcopal priest from Christ Episcopal Church directly across the street from Temple Adas Israel. I've been associated with Temple Adas Israel now for right at 12 years, having come from another area here, and was invited to attend services by Mr. and Mrs. Bubba Marks, and enjoyed being part of them for all these years. I've written up a little history of Temple Adas Israel, along with some explanation of the windows and the symbolism. In fact, perhaps the most impressive of the windows is the window directly over the ark, dedicated to the memory of Amel and Hannah Tam, showing the eye of God looking out over his people, coming from the 121st Psalm, "He that keepeth watch over Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps," dedicated to the Middle Ages. And of course, in the central device, we have the candlestick called the menorah, giving us a reminder that God watches for the religious freedom of all, as he watched over the first great fight for religious freedom, which we know as the Maccabean conflict about 165 BC. The entire window reminds us that God is watching us, God is with us, God is our support, our strength, and help in time of trouble. Immediately over the name dedications, we find the oldest religious creed still in constant use today. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Dedicated to one of the founding families, namely Moses and Hannah Felsenthal, this window's special device is the sages, the wise men and women of Israel, with the effulgent sun. The middle picture shows the living water coming from the rock, the history of which you may remember. The rock supposedly followed the Jewish people throughout their travels in the desert and provided water for them. Behold, the fear of the Lord is wisdom. Between the 2 columns reminds us of the great building blocks of Israel, wisdom, strength, and beauty, which comes from God. This window in memory of Alexander Sternberger is a particularly interesting one dedicated to the psalmists, the poets and musicians of Israel, with the wooden star, the panpipe, and the cedar tree of life. The pictorial device at the bottom of the window shows the rivers of life, or perhaps it could be the rivers of Babylon, by which the Jewish people in captivity sat down and hung their harps on the weeping willows and would not sing the songs of Zion because of their sorrow. The Hebrew word hallelujah, of course, reminds us that this is what the Psalms are for, to sing praises to God. The window in memory of Meyer and Mary Levi Rothschild is particularly dedicated to the Melachim, or kings of Israel. In the central device at the top, we find the six-pointed Mogan, or Star of David. In the lower portion of the window, we have the portico of the temple, sometimes called Solomon's portico. Underneath is inscribed, "Let thine eyes be open toward this house night and day," a portion of the prayer of dedication at the time of the feast of the dedication of the temple. Directly beneath this, we see the steps and the door leading in. On one side, the left, we find a crown and scepter, and on the right, we find the shofar, or the ram's horn. The crown and scepter remind us of the theocracy, or the fact that God was in charge in truth in Israel. And the ram's horn recalls to our mind, indeed, that we are called to the service and worship of God as the ram's horn would call us to the service and worship of God in the temple. Albert and Frances Felsenthal Cohn's window is a particularly interesting one because visitors and tourists to Temple Adas Israel frequently confuse it as being a Christian window, which it is not. The device showing the shepherd leading sheep from the green pastures across the desert area to the cool water is uniquely Hebrew, and of course comes from the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," showing that God indeed is the shepherd of Israel, leading us in our lives, if we will follow, across the barren portions of our life to those places where we can indeed be refreshed by God's living water. The window in memory of Joseph and Regina Felsenthal is particularly interesting in that it is the only window in Temple Adas Israel dedicated to a person. In the central device at the top of the window, we see the name Moses, the great prophet. However, in this device, there is no image, for in keeping with the Jewish law that there be no images of earthly persons made, it was to ensure that we did not turn them into idols. In the lower portion, we see the Ark of the Covenant, sometimes called the mercy seat, with the cherubim with their outstretched, overarching wings sheltering this mercy seat, honoring that person whose name is directly above. The four-letter word, which is not a word, but is more than a word, the not to be pronounced, ineffable name of the Holy One. On either side, we see representations of the 10 words, or the 10 commandments, being supported on either side of them by two great columns, simple in design, indicating strength. Above the entire amount, we see a representation of Mount Sinai, upon which is the cloud of the presence, reminding us that God is with us always. The Abraham and Louise Felsenthal Schaefer window is dedicated to the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and shows the rampant lion, the lion of the tribe of Judah, as
the device at the top. In the middle of the window, we see the Hebrew word Shaddai, which was used as a name for God in the very early years, and stood generally for the God of the mountain, or the Almighty. Immediately beneath this, we see a representation of a lamb or ram being burned on an altar of sacrifice. You'll note the shepherd's crooks or staffs on either end, and reminds us of the gift that was given to God by Abraham in exchange for Isaac. The inscription, "Walk before me and be thou perfect," reminds us that it is impossible to do this, and it is only by the grace and love of God that we are acceptable to God in our daily walks. The Leopold and Amelia Levy window is inscribed, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." As we look at the window, we see the green and fertile land watered by the river of life, flowing, as you will see, directly from the city of God, the center of which is God's temple, the symbol of the presence of God with humanity. All light seems to emanate from the temple, for it is there that God said, "I will dwell with mankind and make my temple with humanity." It is a wonderful reminder that at the end of the 23rd Psalm, we are promised that we will indeed dwell in the house of the Lord forever. In memory of Dr. W.G. Sternberger, the window inscribed, "Ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation," shows the temple or tabernacle in the wilderness that was set up during the wanderings of the Hebrew people on their way to the Holy Land. At the top of the window, we find in the circular device, again, a representation of the Ark of the Covenant, which held the covenant between God and humanity, and inscribed priesthood. It is a wonderful reminder that Israel, having been created especially by God, was called by God to be the mediator between God and all the world, that they should indeed be a nation of priests and a holy nation, showing forth the glory of God to all the world. The final window is one which is often overlooked because it's not brightly lighted and is seen upon entering or leaving the temple. Over the entrance door, the triangular window reminds us of God's admonition to his people in Leviticus 19. "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." What a thought to dwell upon as one enters or leaves.